The air hummed with a mix of conversation and the clinking of glasses in the upscale downtown restaurant. It was one of those places that felt important, even on a Tuesday night. Sarah, a young woman, with a quiet determination in her eyes, navigated the tables with a practiced ease, her prosthetic leg a silent testament to battles fought and won. She spotted an empty seat at a large, otherwise unoccupied table where a man sat alone, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the polished silverware. This was Marcus, a man known in certain circles for his past as a Navy SEAL, a reputation that often preceded him like a heavy shadow. Approaching his table, Sarah paused, a polite smile touching her lips. "Excuse me," she began, her voice calm and clear. "This place is pretty busy. Would you mind if I shared this table?" Marcus didn't even lift his head. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, laced with an unmistakable edge. "Look, lady," he said, without a glance in her direction, "I'm trying to have a quiet meal. You and your situation would probably just make a fuss. Find somewhere else." The words hung in the air, sharp and uninvited. For a fleeting second, a flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed Sarah's face. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was more like a knowing smile, a brief flash of something that suggested she understood him better than he understood himself. Then the smile vanished, replaced by a calm, almost serene expression. She just looked at him for another moment, her gaze steady, before she finally spoke, her voice still even, but with a new, subtle weight to it. "I understand," she said, slowly. "It's not always easy to see past what's right in front of you. But sometimes, what you dismiss as an inconvenience can turn out to be the most important thing you ever overlooked." She didn't wait for a response. Instead, she turned, her movements deliberate and unhurried, and began to walk away. Marcus, who had been so dismissive just moments before, felt an odd, unfamiliar chill creep up his spine. It wasn't the air conditioning. It was a sense of unease, a vague premonition that he couldn't quite shake. He told himself it was just his imagination, the lingering adrenaline from a busy day, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He had intended to wound, to belittle, to put her in her place, but her reaction, or lack thereof, had turned his harsh words into something hollow. Some battles are fought not with strength, but with a quiet resolve. As Sarah's form disappeared into the crowd, Marcus found himself glancing back at the empty space where she had stood. A vague sense of dread, like a cold hand, washed over him. His casual cruelty, his quick dismissal, felt heavier now, as if he had just, without realizing it, set something significant in motion, something he might soon regret. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Sarah's calm departure from the restaurant, the one that left Marcus with an unsettling feeling, wasn't an act. It came from a deep well of resilience, built over a lifetime in a place where community meant everything. She grew up in a mid-sized American city, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and a helping hand was always just a doorstep away. Her family wasn't rich, but they were rich in spirit, instilling in her the values of hard work, perseverance, and looking out for your neighbors. These weren't just words. They were the air she breathed, the foundation of her world. From a young age, Sarah dreamed of becoming a physical therapist. She saw the struggles people faced, the small victories they celebrated, and she wanted to be a part of that journey. She imagined helping others regain their strength, guiding them through the tough times, much like she'd seen her own parents support friends and family through their challenges. Her days were filled with school, volunteering at the local community center, and spending time with her younger brother. Always pushing herself, always learning. Life felt predictable, safe, and full of purpose. Then everything changed in a single devastating moment. In her late teens, a car accident stole her leg, but not her spirit. The recovery was brutal, a marathon of pain, frustration, and learning to navigate a world that suddenly felt alien. There were days she just wanted to give up, days the prosthetic felt like a heavy burden instead of a tool for freedom. But every fall, every setback, she remembered the lessons from her childhood, the faces of her family and friends who cheered her on. She learned to walk again, not just physically, but emotionally, finding a new kind of strength in her vulnerability. This journey taught her to observe, to understand unspoken cues, and to build an inner toughness that few could match. She learned to accept help, but also to stand firmly on her own. During these years, Marcus, the man from the restaurant, was a recurring, if distant, figure in her life. He wasn't a close friend, but he was present in the community. He was the local hero, the ex-Navy SEAL who had served his country. People looked up to him, admired his service, and often excused his bluntness as a soldier's directness. Sarah had heard stories, seen him around town, and even shared a few casual conversations at community events. She knew he had a reputation for being tough, for speaking his mind, sometimes without much thought for others' feelings. His occasional insensitivity wasn't a secret. It was just part of who Marcus was. She remembered one time, at a town hall meeting about accessible ramps for a public building, Marcus had made a comment about special accommodations costing too much, implying that some needs were less important than others. Sarah, still new to her prosthetic, felt a pang, but she saw others in the room nod along. It was a small moment, easily dismissed by many, but it stuck with her. It was a pattern she'd seen before. Marcus, often respected for his past, would use that respect to push his own agenda, sometimes at the expense of others. The restaurant incident wasn't her first encounter with his dismissive attitude, nor was it the first time his words had brushed against a raw nerve. But something about that particular exchange felt different. Maybe it was the public nature of it, or perhaps it was the way he'd so casually targeted her disability. Whatever it was, that moment at the table, his harsh words and her calm response, were the culmination of years of observing him, of understanding the subtle ways his character manifested itself. She knew he was more than just blunt. There was an undercurrent of something less honorable, something she'd dismissed for too long. Her knowing smile wasn't about malice. It was about recognition, about finally seeing the full picture of a man she had, for years, given the benefit of the doubt. She had built her life on overcoming obstacles, and she recognized a new one when she saw it. Those small, uncomfortable moments with Marcus, like the one at the town hall meeting, weren't isolated incidents. Over the years, a pattern emerged, clear as day to anyone paying close attention. And Sarah, with her sharpened senses, certainly was. She remembered a community garden project, a big deal for their neighborhood. Marcus had proudly announced he'd secure donations for new tools and a proper irrigation system. Everyone cheered. He spoke with such conviction, so much authority, that no one doubted him. Sarah, always eager to help, volunteered to organize the tool shed, spending hours labeling and arranging, picturing the new shovels and rakes. But the donations never materialized. Marcus just stopped talking about it, moving on to the next big idea, leaving the garden committee scrambling to buy tools with their meager funds. He never apologized, never explained, It was just another promise that evaporated into thin air, leaving others to clean up the mess. Then there were the veiled humiliations. Marcus had a way of making condescending remarks that sounded almost like advice, especially when he was surrounded by people who admired him. At a neighborhood BBQ, he once saw Sarah struggling slightly to carry a heavy tray of drinks, her prosthetic leg making the balance tricky. Instead of offering help, he loudly declared, "You know, Sarah, sometimes it's smarter to ask for help than to push yourself too hard. No shame in knowing your limits, especially when you've got, you know." He gestured vaguely at her leg. It was meant to sound like concern, but the underlying message was clear. She was limited, and he was pointing it out for everyone to hear. It wasn't the first time he'd made these subtle jabs, always disguised as a tough love or practical advice. Each comment, small on its own, chipped away at her resilience, building a quiet resentment. His manipulative behavior was another layer to his character. He often used his past military service as a shield, a way to gain deference or excuse his brusque demeanor. "As a SEAL, you learn to be direct," he'd often say, cutting off any debate or disagreement. This tactic subtly influenced community decisions. When a proposal for a new youth center was being discussed, Marcus, who preferred a different location, dismissed valid concerns about accessibility by saying, "We need to focus on what's best for the majority, not get bogged down in every minor detail. Sometimes you just have to push through, like we did in the field." People, respecting his service, would often back down even if they disagreed. Sarah watched these exchanges, seeing how easily he swayed opinions by invoking his past, how he used it to avoid accountability. One specific moment of injustice stood out in Sarah's memory. She had poured countless hours into organizing a local food drive, coordinating volunteers, collecting donations, and ensuring every family in need received help. It was a massive undertaking, and she was proud of the community's effort. At the post-event wrap-up meeting, Marcus, who had barely lifted a finger, stood up and criticized her detailed report, questioning her efficiency and suggesting she could have done better with the logistics. He implied her methods were too soft and lacked the necessary discipline. His words, delivered with his usual air of authority, undermined all her hard work and dedication. Sarah felt a burning flush of indignation. Her efforts invalidated, her passion dismissed. It wasn't just about the food drive. It was about the constant invalidation, the feeling that no matter how much she gave, it would never be good enough for someone like Marcus. The restaurant incident, where Marcus so coldly dismissed her, wasn't an isolated event. It wasn't just a bad day for him or a misunderstanding. It was the culmination of years of ingrained disrespect, a long series of emotional slights and broken promises that had finally reached a breaking point. It was the final straw. The moment when Sarah realized that his behavior wasn't just an annoying personality quirk, it was a deeply rooted pattern of disregard for others. And she had finally had enough. The emotional environment around Sarah and Marcus grew heavy, almost suffocating, especially within their shared social circles. It was like a thick fog that settled over every gathering, every community meeting. People started walking on eggshells when Marcus was around, or they just avoided him altogether. The casual conversations that used to flow easily now felt forced, punctuated by awkward silences whenever his name came up. Conflicts intensified, becoming more open and less polite. Marcus's behavior, instead of softening, became more pronounced, almost like he was daring people to challenge him. He'd make a dismissive comment about a local initiative, or openly scoff at someone's suggestion, and where before People might have just grumbled under their breath. Now voices were starting to rise. A few brave souls, tired of his arrogance, began to push back. There was an argument at the town hall about funding for the community garden. Marcus, predictably, wanted to cut it, calling it a waste of resources. An elderly woman, Mrs. Henderson, who had lovingly tended a plot there for years, stood up to him, her voice trembling but firm. She reminded him of the joy it brought, the fresh produce for those in need. Marcus just folded his arms, a sneer on his face, and said, "Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills, ma'am." But this time, others spoke up, supporting Mrs. Henderson, and for a moment Marcus seemed genuinely surprised by the collective pushback. Discussions about his past actions began to surface more frequently, no longer whispered behind cupped hands. People started openly questioning his motives and character. Someone would bring up a forgotten promise he'd made about volunteering at the soup kitchen, or how he'd manipulated a vote on a zoning issue years ago. Each anecdote added another piece to a growing puzzle, painting a picture of someone who often prioritized his own agenda over the well-being of the community. Sarah heard these conversations, sometimes participating, sometimes just listening, feeling a strange mix of validation and dread. It was good that people were finally seeing him for who he was, but it also meant the tension was building, and something had to give. Social pressures on Sarah increased, though unspoken. Her neighbors and even some family members, aware of her long history with Marcus, subtly hinted that she should either tolerate his behavior or confront it. Some urged her to let it go, saying, "That's just Marcus, you know how he is." Others, particularly those who had seen her dedication and his dismissiveness firsthand, looked to her with an expectation, a silent plea for her to do something. She witnessed others being hurt by his words, a young artist whose work he mocked, a small business owner whose plans he publicly undermined. Each new incident deepened her resolve. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about protecting the community she loved from someone who seemed intent on chipping away at its spirit. Marcus's posture only worsened under this growing scrutiny. He became more defensive, more entrenched in his dismissive attitude. Instead of reflecting on the criticism, he doubled down, often using aggressive language to shut down any debate. "You snowflakes are too sensitive," he'd bark. Or, "You clearly don't understand how the real world works." He'd puff out his chest, his eyes narrowed, daring anyone to challenge him further. He seemed to relish the confrontation, turning every discussion into a battle he felt he had to win. This period represented Sarah's deepest emotional suffocation. She felt the weight of the injustice, the collective impact of Marcus's actions on her community. It was a time of quiet agony, watching the man she once admired, or at least tolerated, dismantle the very fabric of trust and cooperation with his relentless negativity and arrogance. She grappled with the unfairness of it all, the way he seemed immune to consequence. Yet she knew, deep down, that this couldn't go on forever. His behavior in the restaurant was just the final public declaration of a long-standing war he'd been waging on decency. And Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was time for someone to finally stand up. The quiet agony Sarah felt didn't last forever. A pivotal event ripped through the community, shaking everyone to their core and exposing Marcus in a way no one had anticipated. A local charity, one that Sarah had poured countless hours into, a place dedicated to providing after-school programs for underprivileged kids, was suddenly facing financial ruin. The news hit like a punch to the gut. Funds were missing, a significant amount, enough to shut down their operations indefinitely. Panic spread through the volunteers and the families who relied on its services. An internal investigation began, initially discreet, then increasingly urgent, as the numbers simply didn't add up. Slowly, painstakingly, the finger of suspicion began to point towards Marcus. He had been a prominent board member, often boasting about his financial acumen and his ability to handle things. He had volunteered to manage the charity's investment portfolio, citing his business experience and patriotism. Now it appeared he had exploited that trusted position, systematically misusing funds for his own gain. This revelation was devastating. It was one thing for Marcus to be insensitive, to be a bully, to break promises. It was entirely another to be a thief, to steal from children and betray the very community he claimed to serve. The truth surfaced through an unexpected source. It wasn't a grand exposé, but a quiet, anonymous tip that led investigators to a former colleague of Marcus's, a man who had worked with him years ago in a different venture. This colleague, weary of Marcus's manipulative tactics and perhaps feeling a pang of conscience, provided irrefutable evidence. Bank statements, forged documents, and a detailed account of how Marcus had siphoned off funds, moving them through shell accounts. Sarah, who had always held a sliver of hope, a tiny stubborn belief that Marcus, despite his flaws, had some core of decency, felt that hope shatter completely. She had always tried to see the best in people, to understand their struggles. Even after all his slights, all his dismissals, she had thought perhaps he was just misguided or deeply unhappy. But this was pure, calculated deceit. It wasn't just insensitivity. It was genuine corruption, a cold disregard for the welfare of others. The proof was undeniable, staring her in the face from the pages of a financial report laid out on her kitchen table. This moment completely shifted the narrative. It moved beyond personal slights, beyond the sting of condescending remarks, and into a much larger betrayal of trust that affected everyone. The man who had once been a local hero, a former Navy SEAL, was now exposed as a common embezzler. The weight of this truth settled on Sarah, heavy and cold. There was no more room for doubt, no more excuses to be made for him. His character was no longer just flawed, it was genuinely deceitful. This devastating revelation, the undeniable proof of his deep-seated corruption, didn't just hurt. It empowered Sarah. It clarified everything. The time for quiet suffering was over. It was time for decisive action. Sarah felt a mix of emotions wash over her, heavy and conflicting. There was profound disappointment, a bitter taste in her mouth for the man she had, against her better judgment, sometimes defended in her own mind. Anger simmered beneath the surface, a hot, indignant rage that someone could so callously betray the trust of an entire community, especially when it involved children. But alongside that, a fierce determination began to solidify. This wasn't just about her anymore, or even just about the charity. This was about justice. She grappled with the weight of exposing someone who, despite his flaws, had once been held up as a community figure, a veteran, a hero. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was clear. Her initial reaction, once the shock wore off, was quiet and methodical. There was no grandstanding, no dramatic pronouncements. Instead, she began to gather information, fueled by an unwavering desire for truth and accountability. She reread the reports, cross-referenced dates, and spoke to people involved with the charity's finances, asking pointed, intelligent questions. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for facts, for the undeniable evidence that would hold up under scrutiny. Every piece of paper, every transaction, every missed detail became part of her silent investigation. As the truth about Marcus's embezzlement slowly began to seep out, the community reacted with a complex range of emotions. Some, particularly those who had benefited from his past favors or were swayed by his charismatic veneer, expressed shock and disbelief. They struggled to reconcile the image of the decorated Navy SEAL, the pillar of the community, with the emerging picture of a deceitful embezzler. Marcus? No, it can't be, they'd say, shaking their heads, trying to protect the illusion they had built around him. They found it hard to believe that someone they respected could betray them so deeply. But others, those who had been quietly wronged by Marcus in the past, or who had seen through his facade, began to emerge as allies. They offered support to Sarah, sharing their own stories of his manipulation, his broken promises, his subtle bullying. An elderly woman recalled how Marcus had promised to fix her roof after a storm, only to disappear after collecting a down payment. A young couple remembered how he had offered to mentor them in their small business, only to steal their client list. These shared experiences validated Sarah's long-held suspicions, confirming that the restaurant incident was just one small piece of a much larger, darker pattern. Their collective voices, once isolated, now formed a chorus of quiet indignation. The cultural dynamics of the United States heavily influenced how the community responded. There's a strong emphasis on justice and holding individuals accountable, especially when public trust is broken, and even more so when it involves a charity for children. The idea that a veteran, someone who swore to protect, would steal from the most vulnerable was particularly galling. Slowly, cautiously, local media began to catch wind of the story. Initial reports were guarded, but the public's demand for transparency grew. Whispers turned into murmurs, then into open discussions in coffee shops and grocery aisles. The community, once hesitant to speak ill of their hero, now felt a collective urge to uncover the full truth. The psychological impact on Sarah was profound. She felt the heavy burden of responsibility, knowing that her actions would shatter lives, including Marcus's, and potentially divide the community. There were sleepless nights, moments of doubt where she questioned if she was doing the right thing, if she was strong enough for this fight. But alongside that burden, a growing sense of purpose took root. She realized she was fighting for something much bigger than herself, bigger than her own hurt. She was fighting for the integrity of her community, for the children who had lost their programs, for every person Marcus had ever taken advantage of. Her actions were no longer just about personal vindication. They were about protecting her neighbors, about upholding a fundamental sense of right and wrong. She was ready. Sarah now channeled her energy into the work of healing and reconstruction. There was no joy in Marcus's downfall, only a grim satisfaction that justice was finally taking its course. She worked closely with the authorities, providing every piece of evidence she had meticulously gathered, ensuring that the legal process moved forward without obstruction. The charity, deeply wounded by the embezzlement, needed a lifeline, and Sarah stepped up, throwing herself into its recovery. She helped organize new fundraising drives, leveraging her newfound community respect to rally support. Her clear vision and unwavering commitment inspired others to donate their time and resources, proving that even after such a deep betrayal, good could still emerge. The consequences for Marcus were severe and public. The legal proceedings were swift, given the overwhelming evidence against him. He was charged with embezzlement and fraud, and the trial became a local sensation. The man who once commanded respect and admiration now sat in a courtroom, stripped of his former glory, his past military service doing little to sway the judge or jury. The public disgrace was immense, a stark contrast to the hero worship he had once enjoyed. He was convicted and sentenced to prison, a painful but necessary outcome for the community to begin its healing. His fall from grace was complete, a cautionary tale whispered in every corner of the town. With Marcus gone, the charity began its arduous journey back to stability. Sarah played a crucial role, not just in fundraising, but in restructuring its internal processes to prevent future abuses. She helped implement stricter financial oversight, introduced new transparency measures, and fostered a culture of accountability. Under her guidance, the charity didn't just recover, it became stronger, more resilient, a true testament to the power of collective effort and ethical leadership. Her natural leadership, coupled with her unwavering commitment, cemented her position as a respected and influential figure in the community. The community itself, initially fractured by the scandal, also began to heal. The shared experience of betrayal and recovery brought people closer together. They learned valuable lessons about true leadership, about the importance of questioning appearances, and about the quiet strength found in unity. The initial shock gave way to a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to rebuild trust and ensure such a breach never happened again. There were open forums, new community initiatives, and a general feeling that while the past was painful, the future could be brighter. The story concluded with a satisfying and realistic resolution. Marcus faced the full consequences of his actions, his life irrevocably altered by his choices. He was no longer the imposing figure, but a man paying for his deceit. Sarah, on the other hand, emerged not as a victim, but as a beacon of strength and integrity. She continued her work with the charity, her efforts making a tangible difference in the lives of many. Her initial act of confronting Marcus in the restaurant, a moment born from years of accumulated slights, had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately brought justice to a community and restored its faith. Her journey was a powerful reflection on the nature of true strength. It wasn't about physical prowess or a commanding presence, but about quiet resolve, unwavering integrity, and the courage to stand up for what is right even when it's difficult. The narrative mused on how even the smallest acts of cruelty, left unchecked, can fester and grow into profound betrayals. But it also showed that when confronted with unwavering integrity, with a spirit like Sarah's, the truth will always find a way to surface, leading to justice and a new beginning. Her resilience, her ability to turn personal pain into a catalyst for positive change, became her enduring legacy, proving that some battles are indeed fought not with strength, but with a quiet, unyielding resolve.